The judge looked at my wife's attorney and said, "Counsel, are you telling me you filed this motion without knowing what your client's husband does for a living?" The attorney hesitated. "Just half a second. But in a courtroom, half a second is a confession." My wife's face went the color of old chalk. I didn't say anything. I've never been the kind of man who needed to. Let me back up. I turned 63 last March. My daughter made a cake, lemon, because she remembered it's the only kind I actually like. We ate it at the kitchen table. Just the three of us, me, her, and my son-in-law. My wife wasn't there. By then, she hadn't been at any family table for 8 months. Not because anyone asked her to leave, because she'd already chosen to be somewhere else. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Her name is Lorraine. We met when I was 31 and she was 28. I was working as a licensed forensic examiner for the county. I reviewed financial records in civil and criminal cases, testified in court when called, and occasionally consulted for federal agencies when they needed someone who could read a balance sheet like a novel and tell you exactly where the lying started. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't supposed to be. I drove a 10-year-old Buick and ate lunch at my desk most days, but I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it, and that was enough for me. Lorraine was a pharmaceutical sales rep at the time. Beautiful, quick with a laugh, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood the social architecture of it. We dated for 2 years, got married in a small ceremony in Columbus, bought a house in Westerville 30 minutes from my office. For a while it was good. I think it genuinely was. Our daughter was born the second year of our marriage. She's 30 now. She has her father's patience and, unfortunately for her, a mother's instinct for reading people. I say unfortunately because once you see something, you can't unsee it. She learned that the hard way. The trouble didn't start all at once. It never does. It starts as a temperature, something slightly off, something you chalk up to stress or a bad week or just the natural cooling that happens in long marriages. You tell yourself it's normal. You tell yourself everyone goes through this. You keep quiet because quiet has always worked for you, because in your professional life, silence is how you gather information. You listen, you watch, you wait for the paper trail. I should have known that strategy doesn't translate to marriage the same way. Lorraine stopped working when our daughter was in middle school. I didn't ask her to. She said she was tired of the road, tired of the quotas, tired of corporate. I said fine. We had enough on my salary. I wasn't rich, but I was steady. And steady is its own kind of wealth if you respect it. What I didn't notice, not right away, was that once she stopped working, she started managing everything. The household accounts, the investment portfolio I'd been building since my late 20s, the credit cards, the insurance policies. She said it made sense since she was home. She said I had enough to think about. She said she was good with numbers. She wasn't wrong about that last part. I gave her access, not because I was foolish. I want to be honest about that. I gave her access because I trusted her, because after 20-something years of marriage, trust is supposed to be the whole point. Because I was working 60-hour weeks and coming home too tired to audit my own life. My mother lived 40 minutes away in a small house in Guyana. She'd bought it with my father before he passed in 1987. She was 81, sharp as ever mentally but slowing down physically. Bad hip, some circulatory issues, the usual accumulation of years. She needed help, and Lorraine volunteered to be that help. Drove her to appointments. Managed her prescriptions. Got her groceries. I was grateful. I told Lorraine that more than once. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that Lorraine had begun what I can only describe as a quiet excavation of my mother's estate. It started with the savings. My mother had a CD account at a regional bank, about $40,000 she'd kept there since the 90s. She trusted Lorraine with her PIN because Lorraine had convinced her it was easier that way. I'll just handle it, June. You don't need to worry about this. Over 18 months, that account was drawn down to just under $4,000. My mother, when I eventually asked, thought the money had gone toward household expenses. She couldn't say which ones. Lorraine had explained it to her, she said. It sounded reasonable at the time. Then there was the jewelry. My mother had a collection. Nothing museum quality, but pieces with family history. My grandmother's engagement ring. A brooch my father gave her on their 30th anniversary. A strand of pearls she wore to every important occasion of her adult life. Lorraine had offered to store them safely at our house while my mother's mobility worsened. By the time I started asking questions, half of them were gone. I found out about a consignment sale in New Albany, a shop that dealt in estate jewelry. I found a receipt in a drawer in Lorraine's home office tucked inside an old birthday card envelope. $11,400. Dated 14 months prior. I didn't say anything. I know that's the part people don't understand. I know people read that and say, "Why didn't you confront her? Why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you do something?" Here's what I've learned in 30 years of examining financial fraud. The moment you reveal what you know, you stop learning what you don't know. The confrontation feels good for about 10 minutes. Then the subject gets careful, moves things, destroys records, lawyers up. You've traded your advantage for a moment of satisfaction. I wasn't interested in satisfaction. I was interested in the full picture. So I started keeping records of my own, quietly. I set up a separate email account. I requested duplicate statements on accounts I was legally entitled to access. I photographed documents. I noted dates, amounts, discrepancies. I consulted off the books, as a personal matter, with a colleague who handled elder financial abuse cases. What I found over the following year was not a wife who'd made some bad decisions. What I found was a pattern. Systematic, deliberate, and patient. She hadn't stolen impulsively. She had planned. In addition to my mother's savings and jewelry, Lorraine had redirected approximately $60,000 from our joint investment account into a separate account in her name only, opened at a bank we'd never used together. She'd done it in increments small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts. She'd also changed the beneficiary designations on 2 of my life insurance policies. Designations I hadn't reviewed in years because I had no reason to think anyone had touched them. I want to say I was shocked, but I work in fraud. I know what it looks like. And when I'm honest with myself, I know there were signs I'd talked myself out of seeing, because I didn't want them to be true. Our daughter noticed before I did that her mother had changed. Not dramatically. Just cooler, more strategic in conversation. Less interested in anything that didn't serve an immediate purpose. My daughter called me one Sunday afternoon from her apartment in Cincinnati and said, "Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to actually answer me." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is everything all right with you and Mom, like financially?" I told her I was looking into some things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's been asking me questions. About your retirement accounts. About your pension." I didn't think much of it at first, but she stopped. "Dad," it felt like she was gathering information. She was right. She was absolutely right. And I was proud of her for seeing it, and sorry she had to. What I hadn't anticipated was that Lorraine would move first. In February, 2 years after I'd started quietly documenting, she filed a motion in Franklin County Domestic Court. Specifically, she filed for a legal separation and simultaneously filed a petition claiming financial elder abuse, naming me as the responsible party. In a filing, she alleged that I had been mismanaging the household accounts, that I had misappropriated funds belonging to my mother, and that I was mentally and financially incompetent. Let me say that again. She accused me of doing exactly what she had done. My daughter called me in tears when she found out. She'd seen the filing. Lorraine had apparently told her about it before telling me. "Dad, this doesn't make any sense. You would never." And she was crying, and I could hear how confused she was, how the ground had shifted under her feet. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I told her to stay calm. I told her the truth always finds its way out eventually, and that I had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. My son-in-law, to his credit, drove 4 hours from Cincinnati to sit with me the night I was formally served. He didn't say much. He just showed up. That mattered more than he knows. I retained an attorney, a woman named Catherine who had 30 years in family law and a reputation in the Columbus legal community for being absolutely uninterested in theatrics. She reviewed everything I'd compiled. She was quiet for a long time when she finished. "You've been running a parallel investigation of your own marriage," she said. "I have," I said. "For how long?" "2 years." She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "Most people wait until they're desperate." "I know," I said. "I wasn't going to wait until I was desperate." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in April. I wore the same suit I've worn to court. Testimony for 15 years. Charcoal grey. Conservative tie. I got there early and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Catherine and a banker's box of documentation I'd organized by date, account number, and document type. Lorraine arrived with her attorney, a man I'll call her counsel, 15 minutes later. She was dressed well. Her expression was composed and precise. She didn't look at me. Her counsel had clearly built his entire case on the assumption that I was exactly what his client had described. A man who had checked out of his own household, who didn't understand his own finances, who had allowed an elderly woman to be taken advantage of while looking the other way. He was prepared to argue negligence at best, complicity at worst. What he was not prepared for was the judge. The Honorable Patricia Whaley had been on the Franklin County bench for 19 years. She was known for being methodical, for having very little patience for attorneys who hadn't done their homework. She reviewed the preliminary filings for several minutes before she said anything. Then she looked up at Lorraine's counsel and said, "Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify the respondent's professional background for the record. Can you tell me what Mr. Hartley does for a living?" Lorraine's counsel said, "He's listed as a retired county employee, Your Honor." Judge Whaley looked at the file again. "That's not what I see here." She paused. "Are you telling me you filed this motion without knowing what your client's husband does for a living?" The half-second hesitation. The chalk-white face beside him. I had spent 31 years as a licensed forensic financial examiner. I had testified as an expert witness in over 200 civil and criminal proceedings in Ohio. I had consulted on 3 federal investigations. My professional signature appeared on documents that had sent people to prison for exactly the kind of financial fraud that had been committed against my mother and against me. Lorraine had filed a financial misconduct complaint against the man who had spent his entire career identifying financial misconduct. Judge Whaley gave Lorraine's counsel a look I recognized. I've seen it in courtrooms when an attorney realizes, very suddenly, that the ground beneath them is not what they thought it was. "We're going to need a short recess," he said. "Yes," said Judge Whaley. "I think you will." I don't want to make the next part sound easy, because it wasn't. Court never is. Even when you have the documentation, even when you have the professional credibility, even when the other side is clearly in the wrong, it still takes time. It still costs money. It still requires you to sit in rooms and hear things said about you that aren't true, and keep your face neutral and your voice level and trust the process. But the process worked. Catherine presented the bank records, the account statements, the consignment shop receipt, the redirected insurance beneficiaries, the incremental transfers. All of it organized and time-stamped and cross-referenced the way I would have organized elements in any professional case. Lorraine's financial elder abuse allegation against me was dismissed within the first hour. The court-appointed financial guardian who had reviewed my mother's accounts, at my request filed 4 months prior, submitted a report that afternoon, confirming the pattern of unauthorized withdrawals. A forensic accountant Catherine had retained, a former colleague of mine who I'd known for 20 years, presented his analysis of the investment account transfers. Lorraine's attorney asked to speak with his client during a second recess. They were in the hallway for a long time. My daughter had driven up from Cincinnati that morning. She sat in the gallery behind me. I didn't turn around much, but once, during a recess, I looked back and she was just watching me with an expression I recognized from when she was small. That particular steadiness she'd get when something was frightening, and she was deciding not to let it frighten her. She gave me a small nod. I gave her one back. By the end of the second day, Lorraine had changed the filing. The older abuse allegation against me was withdrawn. The separation proceeding moved forward, but on terms that reflected the actual financial record. My mother was named the primary victim in a separate civil referral. The redirected insurance beneficiaries were restored. The investment account transfers were flagged for potential criminal review by the county prosecutor's office, a referral that I later learned resulted in a formal investigation. I want to say something here because I've been thinking about it for months, and I'm not sure I've ever said it out loud. There are people who will hear this story and say I should have acted sooner, that I was foolish to stay quiet as long as I did, that my silence put my mother at risk, put our finances at risk, put my daughter in an impossible position. They're not entirely wrong. There's a version of this story where I speak up 18 months earlier, where I confront Lorraine when I first find the consignment receipt, where I call the bank the moment I notice the CD balance, where I don't let professional habit override what a husband should do when he suspects his wife is harming the people he loves most. I sat with that version for a long time. I still sit with it sometimes on mornings when I can't sleep and the house is too quiet, but I also know this. The case I was able to bring to court was complete. Every piece of the pattern was documented. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every redirected beneficiary. The documentation was so thorough that the county prosecutor told Catherine it was among the most organized referrals they'd received in a civil-to-criminal matter. My mother received restitution. The full amount that had been taken from her savings was recovered. The jewelry was not. The pieces had been sold and dispersed, but the financial value was included in the civil settlement. My mother is 83 now. She still lives in her house in Gahanna. My daughter visits her every other Sunday. Last Thanksgiving, I drove over and the three of us ate together at that old kitchen table that's been in the family since before I was born. And my mother told a story about my father that I'd never heard before. And my daughter laughed until she cried. That's the ending I was working toward, not a dramatic courtroom moment, though that happened too. The ending I wanted was that table. Those people. That ordinary Thursday in November with turkey from a grocery rotisserie because none of us wanted to spend 6 hours cooking, and football on in the background, and my mother's stories, I got it. My daughter asked me once, a few weeks after the hearings concluded, whether I regretted staying quiet as long as I had. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told her I regretted not defending my mother sooner. I told her that silence has limits, and I had stayed inside mine for too long. I told her there's a difference between patient silence and willful blindness, and I wasn't always sure I'd stayed on the right side of that line. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "But you didn't disappear. You just didn't announce yourself. That's my daughter. 30 years old, and she's already figured out something it took me decades to learn. You don't have to be loud to be present, but you do have to be present, fully, without exceptions." They do have to be present. The silence has to be strategic, not a substitute for showing up. I know that now. I knew it too late for some things, but I know it. The house in Westerville is going on the market in the spring. I'd been looking at smaller places further east toward Newark, where my father grew up, somewhere with a good porch and enough land to keep a garden. My daughter thinks I should get a dog. My son-in-law has already started sending me listings. I turn 64 this March. My daughter has already asked about the cake. Lemon, I told her. Same as always. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom, not the judge's question, or the attorney's silence, or my wife's face going pale beside him. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than all of that. It's my daughter, sitting in the gallery behind me, giving me a single nod when our eyes met during the recess. 30 years old. Steady as anything. That nod said, "I know who you are. I always knew." That's what Lorraine never understood. She spent years constructing a version of me, absent, passive, financially oblivious, and she was so convinced by her own construction that she filed it in court. She genuinely believed I wouldn't be able to defend myself, and I think that says something important about what happens when a person trades their integrity for short-term gain. The math feels clean at first. A little here, a little there. No one notices. But the logic is rotten at the foundation, because it requires you to underestimate the people around you. It requires you to keep assuming no one is paying attention. And that assumption, held long enough, becomes its own undoing. I'm not saying I was blameless in how things unfolded. I've said it before and I mean it. I stayed quiet too long. I let the professional habit of patience override the husband's obligation to protect his family. My mother deserved someone who would speak up sooner. My daughter deserved a father who didn't wait for the evidence to be airtight before he acted. There's no clean way to account for that, and I don't try to. But here's what I also know. The work I did in those 2 years of quiet documentation, that work required something of me that I'm not sure I'd always had. It required me to think clearly when I was angry. It required me to act with precision when every instinct said, confront her now, demand answers, make the feeling stop. Doing the right thing and doing the easy thing are almost never the same thing, and the gap between them is where your actual character lives. I had to choose over and over again to stay in that gap, to keep going, to trust that the truth, properly documented, would eventually speak louder than any argument I could have in the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this, if they take anything. Not that silence is always wisdom. It isn't, and I paid a price for learning that distinction too late. But that clear thinking is an act of courage, that holding yourself to a standard of evidence, of honesty, of doing the thing correctly rather than just doing it loudly. That takes more out of the person than most people realize. Lorraine counted on me being too emotional or too defeated to think straight. She was wrong. My mother got her money back, not the jewelry. Those pieces are gone. But the financial value was recovered, and she still lives in her house, and she still tells stories about my father at Thanksgiving. My daughter visits her every other Sunday. I'm 63 years old, and I'm buying a house with a good porch, and I'm going to plant a garden in the spring. Some things you have to lose before you understand what you were protecting. And some things, the right ones, you get to keep.